Hello, children of God. This is a review video for your Unit 2-1 study guide so that you can do very well on your test. I'd just like to remind you all of the notes and everything are available on Plus Portals as well as the study guide, and also to please use your textbook. It's a very wonderful textbook. It has a great glossary in the back. It'll be very, very useful for you, particularly Chapter 5 and the beginning of Chapter 6 will be very useful for you. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to jump right in with the terms. The first term is new monarchies. This refers to the first large, powerful countries in Europe, like England and France and Spain and Hungary and the Ottoman Empire as well. So no longer like we had through much of the Dark and Middle Ages, where we had these little feudal kingdoms. So a lot of those kingdoms start to get united and really become what we would call today countries or nation states. And with that comes the rise of nationalism, people feeling like, hey, I'm English, I'm French, not just, I'm Christian or, I belong to this tribe or something like that. The Confession of Augsburg was a peace treaty between Lutherans and Catholics in the Holy Roman Empire. Actually, that's not true. That's false. That's a lie. I'm thinking of the Peace of Augsburg, which was a peace treaty. This is not a peace treaty. This is a founding council of Lutherans. This is when the Lutherans first got together and said, hey, we're going to be like something different than Catholicism. This Reformation thing's been going on long enough. We're going to sit down and say, this is what we believe. So Luther's there and a bunch of the other early Lutheran leaders. Renaissance humanism is a movement that celebrates and studies human accomplishment. So if you think of the great Renaissance artists and that sort of thing through the 14 and 1500s, and it was a very big influence on the beginning of the Reformation because people were celebrating human achievement and knowledge, and people were into learning much more and that sort of thing, and thinking for themselves and writing and debating, those sorts of things. The Institutes of the Christian Religion is the name of a book. It's John Calvin's Encyclopedia of Theology that he wrote, where he wrote down everything he thought, and it's the foundation of what we call Reformed theology, which is like Calvin's school of theology. So Presbyterians and Baptists tend to follow that school of theology. Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam, we had homework by him called Julius Excluded, where he wrote a scathing condemnation of Julius II, who was a Renaissance pope. Erasmus was a Dutch Christian humanist. He spent a lot of time debating with Luther. You might want to mention him if you end up doing SAC. Theocracy is a form of government where the religious leaders are also the civil leaders. This happened in Geneva when John Calvin succeeded in taking over the city of Geneva in Switzerland during the Reformation and made it a theocracy. Cardinal Jimenez de Cisneros of Spain was a cardinal through the end of the 15th and into the 16th century, end of the 1400s, into the 1500s, who largely kept the Reformation from happening in Spain because there was no need for it. He got rid of a lot of the abuses and cleaned up a lot of the religious orders and that sort of thing. He also started this thing called the Inquisition, which during his age was not like brutal and bad as we think about it now. Later on, it'll get brutal. But for him, it was more about regulating conversions and investigating heresy and that sort of thing. There weren't the brutal punishments that happened later. The Act of Supremacy is when Henry VIII decided that he was going to be the head of the Church of England because he wanted to get an annulment from his wife, and the Pope wouldn't grant it. And so he said, well, if I'm my own Pope, I can give myself a divorce or annulment or whatever I want. So he split the Church in England off from the rest of the Catholic Church, and that became the Anglican Church. Conciliarism was a movement in the 14 to 1500s that saw councils, ecumenical councils, as superior to the Pope. Many popes feared this, hence they didn't call a lot of councils or allow councils to do much, which ended up in why we had a need for reform. The Anglican Church, as I said, is the name for the Church of England after the split. John Calvin is the most famous French reformer. He governed Geneva according to Reformed theology. He also wrote the Institutes of the Christian Religion. We talked about him a little bit already. Notes 4 is all about him. I'll write that in there. Notes 4. The Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits, was founded by Ignatius Loyola. They're known. They're still around today. They have lots of schools. They're known for education, also service to the poor, and also they take a special vow of loyalty to the Pope. Johann Tetzel is the guy who really upset Martin Luther. He was selling indulgences, trying to raise money for the bishop of his province in the Holy Roman Empire, and also for Leo X, who was raising funds for the building of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And basically he was promising people, hey, you give me money, I'll get your loved ones out of purgatory for you, which upset Luther a little bit. The Discalced Carmelites are a reform version of the Carmelite order. They're a monastic order, and Teresa of Avila reformed them to focus more on simplicity. Discalced literally means without socks, so if you can remember that, you can remember that. They were a much more simplified version of the order, and they were one of the orders that helped kind of on the ground level reform the church during the 1500s. Henry VIII was the King of England during the Protestant Reformation. At first, he argued and debated with Luther and even wrote a document. Probably Thomas More wrote it, but he signed it. His name was on it. Defending the church and condemning Luther, and was named by Leo X as a defender of the faith. But later, he is going to split with the church because he wants an annulment, and the Pope won't give it to him. So he has the Act of Supremacy signed and passed into law, and that makes him the head of the Church of England. The Oratory of Divine Love is a group of priests who, lots of them became very, very influential in the church, especially at the Council of Trent, and a lot of the Reformed bishops who actually made the changes that needed to be changed were members of the Oratory earlier in their life. Charles V is the most important and powerful monarch of the age. He's the most powerful king. He's the king of Spain. He's also the king of Austria-Hungary. He owns a ton of land. You can read about him, I think, in notes 2. Let's take a look at that. I think it's notes 2. When we talk about new monarchies. Yeah, Charles V. That's him right there. So that's all his land. And he ends up being voted as Holy Roman Holy Roman Emperor as well. And he very hard tries to prevent a schism. The Feast of Our Lady of the Rosary commemorates the victory of the European Christian alliance against the Ottoman navy at the Battle of Lepanto. St. Pius V manages to get all these different nationalistic countries to actually agree and fight together against the Ottomans. And he has everyone in Europe pray the Rosary. The Rosary wasn't that big of a thing before this. This is what made the Rosary a big deal. And they kind of miraculously won this battle, and so they commemorated it with a feast that they called Our Lady of Victory. Nowadays we call it Our Lady of the Rosary, because we like to celebrate the Rosary more than we do, military victories. Francis I was the French king during the Reformation. He's going to make an alliance with the Ottomans against the Spanish. He's rivals with Charles V, and is going to try to use the Reformation to screw things up in the Holy Roman Empire so he can gain power against Charles. Spanish Inquisition, we talked about that a little bit already when we talked about Cisneros, so I'm going to skip that. All right, so I don't know how to pronounce this, but I'm going to butcher it. Cujus regio, ejus religio, and that's Latin for whoever reigns, his religion. It was the official pronouncement of religion in the Holy Roman Empire after decades of fighting. The Schmalkaldic League, which was all the Lutheran provinces, were fighting against Charles V and all the Catholic provinces. And after many, many years of fighting, they eventually have a peace treaty at the Peace of Augsburg. And they decide, you know what, if your prince is Lutheran, then you guys can be Lutheran. If your prince is Catholic, then you guys can be Catholic. But whoever reigns that province, his religion is going to be the official religion of that province. The 30 Years' War comes in the 1600s, the 17th century, and it's the most bloody European war until we get to World War I. And it's in the Holy Roman Empire mostly. It involves a lot of different countries, Catholics and Protestants fighting against each other, sometimes fighting with each other, against Catholics versus Catholics, Protestants versus Protestants. It's kind of a very complex war, but it is definitely a very bloody conflict that is the fallout of the Reformation. The 95 Theses, what started the Reformation off, it was Martin Luther, his original beef with what was going on in his province religiously, and he has these 95 things that he wants to talk about, and he posts them to the door at Wittenberg, where he's a professor, and it blows up and ends up all over Europe via the printing press, and that's what starts the Reformation. The Battle of Vienna is when the Ottoman Turks nearly conquer Central Europe. And I think that's like 1526, something like that. But anyway, that's part of the alliance with France trying to, weaken Charles V. All right, so on to these questions. What's the difference between a reform and a reformation? You can find this in notes 2. A reform, as I've just defined it, is not so much a break with the past, but a renewal of things from the past. You define doctrines, you set practices, you correct abuses, and kind of get back on track. Whereas a reformation is a much more radical change, kind of starting something new. It's a restructuring from the ground off. It's a break with the institution that came before. Major contributing factors. This is what notes 1 and 2 are all about, specifically notes 2. I'm going to put notes 1 in there as well. Notes 1 and 2. But in brief, Renaissance humanism, the not great popes we had pre the Reformation, the printing press, which allowed the spread of ideas, the new monarchies, which encouraged people to place national priorities over religious priorities, and the Black Death, which killed off a lot of the really good priests and nuns and clergy, and also made people really obsessed with getting into heaven, which made them kind of ripe for exploitation at the hands of indulgence sellers, and also just kind of made people really angry at all the authority figures, including the church. 3, why was the development of the printing press so important in the Reformation? Because it allowed things to go viral. You couldn't contain ideas as easily anymore. Martin Luther's crisis of faith, you can read about this in notes 3, and it was all about how do I get right with God? How do I get justified with God? He was very, very scrupulous. He was kind of a perfectionist, and he thought, man, no matter how many indulgences I do or pilgrimages I go on or how often I go to confession or pray to the saints or venerate relics, no matter what I do, I'm still not right with God. So that led him to the first tenet of his theology, is that it's all based upon our faith. It's not any of the works that we do. He saw a big divide between our faith and actions that we do, any of our works. And so that was the first tenet of his theology, is really only our faith can save us, nothing that we do. We don't earn our way into heaven. Okay, all good so far. Catholics agree with that. Sola Scriptura, he said, only Scripture is the key to Christian teaching, not church tradition. Thought when we get in church traditions, that's how you get the abuses with indulgences and so forth. That's where he's starting to break with the church tradition. Then Sola Dei, only God is the authority, not the Pope or not the church. He became convinced through the events of the Reformation that the Pope and the church authority couldn't be trusted. They'd become hopelessly corrupted, so we couldn't trust them. Also, he really emphasized the negative effects of original sin. He thought we were poop covered in snow, whereas Catholics tend to think of ourselves as we're made in the image of God. Yes, we're corrupted by sin, but we're still good at our core. Luther sees it as sin has corrupted us so much that we're just poop, and the snow of God's grace kind of covers us so you can't see us and smell us, but still we're poop at the core. So he sees original sin as much more corruptive, corrosive, I guess I should say, than Catholics do. Main points of Calvin's theology. He agrees with Luther on original sin. That's called total depravity. You can remember these 5 points of Calvin's theology by TULIP. That's the acronym. This is all in notes 4. Unconditional election is the idea of double predestination, that God chooses who is saved and he chooses who is damned. Limited atonement, which is the idea that Jesus only died for those who were saved. He didn't die for those who were damned, because why would he die for those who are damned, and why would they be damned if Jesus died for them? Irresistible grace, the idea that if God elects you, if you are some part of the elect, if God saves you, then you aren't going to be able to deny it. God's grace is irresistible. And then the idea that once you are saved, you can't be lost. And if it seems like you were living a saved life and then became lost, then you weren't really saved in the first place. So that's called 5-point Calvinism. His theocracy in Geneva was very rigid, very strict. There was no gambling, dancing, jewelry, any of that stuff. And if they thought you were a heretic, you could be punished, tortured, even put to death. Henry VIII split from the Catholic Church. We talked about that. Pope wouldn't give him an annulment. Some of the events that might have been able to keep the church from a schism, this would be very good for if you're doing SAC, specifically take a look at note 6, where it talks about the Fifth Lateran Council, Cardinal Reginald Pole, and Popes Adrian VI and Marcellus II, this slide right here. The goals of the Council of Trent, to what extent were they accomplished? The 3 main goals they had were to reunite Catholics and Protestants. That was not successful. They wanted to clearly state doctrine. That did happen, and they wanted to reform practices. That happened too. This is also in notes 6. And 11, what were some of the long-term effects of the Reformation on the Church? and the world. This will be in Note 7, and if you take a look at Note 7, it spends a lot of time going through this. All the different wars, the Spanish Inquisition. It talks about how this launches the age of missionary work. But even today, there's divisions across the world from the Reformation, and also trends in the Catholic Church after the Reformation. Okay, but certainly a lot of violence, a lot of division. All right, we're going to pause there, and I'll come back with part 2.